Hey, good afternoon. This is Mr. Holly. We'll be looking at Lesson 5, Understanding the Subtraction of Integers and Other Rational Numbers. And this is one of my favorite lessons of the 7th grade year because today we're going to have a huge paradigm shift. The way you think about a certain math operation is going to change forever. In previous years, like as a child, you probably learned subtraction means, and a lot of people, if we were to take a poll around the class, a lot of people would say subtraction means to make it smaller, to make something smaller. That's what, anytime we use the term subtraction, we're making something smaller. Well, we are going to test to see, is that really always the case? And we're going to look at subtraction with positive and negative integers today. So, this first page, actually the first 2 pages, are classwork that we would be doing in class, kind of like a activity. So I'm going to just remove these because I don't think they pertain to, they're not good for just direct instruction like this. So let's start with example 2. And we're going to look at first addition. So if I had the cards 4 and 2, what would be the value of my hand? Example 2. Okay, so here's 4 and 2, and I could go ahead and do that on the number line. The value of my hand is 6. Now, what if I subtract, meaning to take away, 2? What if I take this 2 away? Well, right now I have 4 and 2, but if I take this 2 away, now I'm still at 4. Take the 2 away, I'm at 4. Right? Let's look at another thought though. But what if I had that 4 and that 2, and instead of taking the 2 away, I'm going to add a negative 2. So instead of subtracting 2, I'm going to add negative 2. Well, let's look at what that does. 4 plus 2 plus negative 2. And I'm at 4. So I get 4 this way as well. So what I want us to see here is when I looked at these cards, if I took away the 2, I was left with 4. If I added a negative 2, I was also left with 4. So it was the same outcome either way. So what we might want to say about this is removing or subtracting a positive card changes the score in the same way as adding a card whose value is the additive inverse or the opposite. In this case, adding the corresponding negative, because we're taking away a positive, so if we just add the corresponding negative instead of taking away the positive, it ends up being the same value. I think this last sentence is pretty confusing. What I think we need to focus on is subtracting is the same as adding the additive inverse or the opposite. And I might even just write that down here. Subtracting is the same as adding the opposite. Go back up to here. Subtracting is the same as adding the opposite. Say that more time. Subtract 2, add negative 2. We get the same answer either way. Subtracting is the same as adding the opposite. Okay, now let's look at the next page. We're doing example 3. What's a little bit different about example 3 is that now we are dealing with a negative value of negative 2. So I have 4 and negative 2. The sum of my hand is 4 plus negative 2 sum is 2. Okay? Now, the question that we're posed with this time is what happens when we remove this negative 2? And this, folks, is the paradigm shift. This is when everything changes for you. This is a big 7th grade idea for you to wrap your brain around, okay? So look, 4 plus negative 2 gives us a sum of 2. 2. That's the value of my hand right now. It's at 2. But what happens if I subtract this negative 2? What happens if I remove this negative 2? What is my sum? Well, my sum is now 4. So what happened to my sum when I removed or subtracted a negative? It went from 2 to 4, so it increased. So in all of your years of math, when you've been saying subtract means to make things smaller, means to make things smaller, means to make things smaller, not always. Because in this case, we are subtracting a negative, and our sum now gets much, well, in this case, difference. Our value of our hand becomes greater. It increases. Okay? All right. Let's show you that in another way. If I'm saying 4 plus negative 2, or excuse me, I have 4 plus negative 2. I said if I subtracted a negative 2, I would be left with 4. That would be the same as adding a positive 2. Would my sum here still be 4? 4 plus negative 2 plus 2? Yes, it would. So subtracting the negative 2 is actually the same as adding the positive 2. Now let me just show you this on these number lines. We've looked at it with the cards. Let's go back to the number lines. 4 and plus negative 2, but I'm going to remove the negative 2. So I'm still at 4. Or 4 plus negative 2, and then I'm going to add 2. So whether I remove the negative 2 or add a positive 2, either way I'm at 4. The point being that removing or subtracting a negative card changes the score in the same way as adding a card whose value is the additive inverse. Additive inverse is a synonym for opposite, just to remember. In this case, we were adding the corresponding positive. So all we're saying is subtracting negative 2 is the same as adding positive 2. And we can go back to what we said on the previous page. Subtracting is the same as adding the opposite. That's what we want to take away from this lesson. So as we start to look at some subtraction problems, we are going to do so by adding the opposite. A is a simple problem that you should be able to think through on your own. 8 minus 2 is 6, right? So we want to look at it through 7th grade eyes now. 7th grade eyes would say, well, subtraction is the same as adding the opposite, so I want to rewrite this as 8 plus negative 2. 8 to the right, 2 to the left, that is 6. So 8 minus 2 and 8 plus negative 2 are the same, because subtraction is the same as adding the opposite. The opposite of 2, negative 2. 4 minus 9 would be 4 plus negative 9. And that's going to be negative 5. You can think about that. If you want to decompose these numbers, that's 4 plus negative 9 would be a negative 4 and a negative 5, right? And then that creates 0, and I have negative 5 left. So 4 plus negative 9 is negative 5. Negative 3 minus 7 is negative 3 plus negative 7. And if I think about that, they're both going to the left, so I can add the values together, get negative 10. negative 9 minus negative 2. Now, I am subtracting a negative. Let's think out loud. What's going to happen to the value of negative 9 when I subtract a negative? Change subtraction to addition, add the opposite, and negative 9 becomes negative 7, which is greater. The value increased. Even though it's still negative, it did increase. All right, let's come down here on number 2. Find the differences. Negative 2, I'm going to change subtraction to addition, and I'm going to add the opposite. So I'm going to add 5. Negative 2 plus 5 is going to be 3. And you can break these apart. If you want to break it up like I showed you previously, you can think about this as negative 2 plus 5 is 2 plus 3, right? So these create 0, and then I have 3 is what I'm going to have left. That's going to be my sum. 11 minus negative 8. 11 plus the opposite of negative 8 is 8. That's going to be 19. All right, pause the video. Why don't you try on C? Why don't you try to rewrite that? Okay, did you rewrite this as negative 10 plus the opposite of negative 4, which is 4? Negative 10 plus 4 is negative 6. Right, our final question here. Write two expressions that represent the situation. What is the difference in their elevations? An airplane flies at an altitude of 25,000 feet, so we're going to call that 25,000. And a submarine dives to a depth of 600 feet below sea level. So, I could say the difference, what sign would I use? Subtraction. The difference is 25,000 minus negative 600. That's the difference. But it asks for two equivalent expressions. What expression would be the same as minus negative 600? Well, the same thing would be to add the opposite and say plus 600. And the answer, 25,600. Sorry, 25,600. And if you want to think about that on a number line real quick, why would we add those two together? Well, if we're at 0, 25,000 is up here, negative 600 is just below. I'd have to go 25,000 to get to 0, and then another 600 to get to negative 600. So that's why the distance is going to be actually greater than 25,000. We'll be adding these together. Okay, big paradigm shift, big change. Continue to trust that process. Rewrite every problem by changing subtraction to addition and making the second integer its opposite. Whatever the integer is, just change the sign of the integer. All right, thank you.